Hey everybody, good morning. Mestre Sukuri coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. Man, reflecting here the fact that next week on the 22nd of August is my birthday and I will be turning 52. But also reflecting on August 22nd, it was the first time I taught a class in Kawasaki here in the southern part of Tokyo, more in Kanagawa. And it was the first class that I'd ever taught of capoeira in Japan. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. So happy anniversary to me, Capoeira Zoador, and to all the Capoeira Zoadores out there. Today I have a very special topic. I'm going to be talking about how Capoeira Angola and Regional developed and the different aspects from an educated point of view, not just hearsay or what people think, but actually having done the research. Before I do that, I do have to do a little bit of housekeeping. Up until next week, I'm actually going to be pushing the Patreon as much as I can. So this episode today will also be public. And of course, you guys will get it first here on Patreon. So Patreon is a way for people to support me. Like if I was an independent NPO in the United States, right? Imagine I'm like the National Endowment of the Arts and you give money to an NPO and you know and you trust that they're going to do something amazing with it. Well, Patreon is like that. The easiest way also to understand it is kind of old school. For example, like Da Vinci, when the patrons of Italy, the rich people of Italy or the people who had money would give him money and not to do anything special, but to just create. And that's what Patreon does. So I put a couple of descriptions up there. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, please jump on. I'm really going to be pushing until next week. I have several goals and several videos that I'll be putting out over the next week, including my daily podcast here. So if you're interested in becoming a member at Patreon, just hit the link below and join up. I'm going to be doing a lot of the events that I'm hoping to do. I'm going to continue everything I do, and the Patreon basically supports that, such as I'm still planning my Asia tour, cultural events that I want to do every couple months here in Japan to show the world the beauty of Afro-Brazilian culture, primarily of capoeira and what I do. Also, of course, the mentorship, the weekly classes that I'll be doing. Tomorrow, I'll be filming my first weekly class online for my Patreon community so they can take a look and they can train by themselves. So if you're interested in that, come on in. And of course, all of that is supported by my Patreon supporters. Great. So let's jump into the difference of how we now have today in capoeira. We have Capoeira Angola and Capoeira Regional. And I know there's a lot of ways people think about it and how it grew, but I'm going to be giving you something more of an academic or what I want to call a researched point of view. And this, I hope that helps you understand because it has a lot more to do with popular understanding of how things work in capoeira, but also how culture works, right? A lot of times people are giving personal opinion, but I want to give you guys my personal opinion based on the research I've done as a cultural anthropologist. So before I can talk about how capoeira grew into two main groups, Angola and Regional, I want to talk about something that's very important to this conversation. So the number one thing is understanding a concept in cultural anthropology and anthropology and sociology. It's called cultural currency. Let me say that again. Cultural currency. What is cultural currency? Cultural currency is basically the idea that non-tangible goods, for example, when you buy something at the store, like food, like say you get a hamburger or you buy a new phone or you pay your rent, you're getting something tangible, something you can physically see, something that you physically can use or understand the value because you can touch it, see it, or use it. Cultural currency is used a lot in respect to things such as dance, right? Ballet, hip hop, African dance, Russian dance, whatever you want to, yoga. All of these things have a certain amount of what we like to call cultural currency. People are willing to give money or support it because they feel there is a value in it, and this value is called cultural currency. For example, what we call like ballet, people see ballet and they go, wow, actually it's just people moving, but because of what we believe to the high value of the cultural currency, then we put ballet so high, and people are willing to give, large amounts of money, time, energy to support the art of ballet. I love ballet, so that's why I wanted to talk about that. Cultural currency can also be so little as, for example, when a lot of Japanese, I'm sure a lot of people do it, but I'm going to talk about my experience here in Japan. A lot of Japanese will go to New York or to LA and train hip hop or any other African American dance. And even if it's only for a short time, they receive a lot of cultural currency. Japanese culture has a long tradition of, since the Meiji era, of sending people abroad for short, focused study, and with the belief that when they come back, because they're Japanese and because they focused on studying, that they are more competent and more able to be an expert on that subject. For example, a lot of times people will go to, well, here's a great story. During the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji period here, many young Japanese men were sent abroad to Germany, for example, and they were sent to study military, like engineering. And it was strange for the universities in Germany, because many of the young Japanese were only focused, I only want to learn engineering for cannons, for example. They didn't want to learn anything else. They didn't want to take any classes on any other type of engineering. They were just there focused on that. When they came back to Japan, they were considered the experts on that. So there was a certain amount of, technical understanding, but also understanding that you studied abroad and you have that abroad knowledge or that international knowledge, and that gave you also a sense of cultural currency. So, for example, in the realm of capoeira, the more authentic, and when I say authentic, I'm putting up the quotation marks, because authenticity is also a very subjective way of looking at things, especially when it comes to culture, right? Because if we say Brazilian culture, then we're really saying something that is very broad. For example, are we talking about Brazilian culture, the cowboys from the German and Italian descent in the South? Or are we talking about the deep Afro-Brazilian roots in Roma Negra, Black Rome, we call that in Bahia? Or are we talking about more in the interior of Brazil, where there's a lot of more native or Amerindian influence in the culture? What are we talking about? Are we talking about soccer culture? So all of these different things create a form of cultural currency. And in Brazil, with capoeira, it's something that happens in a very I don't want to say pre-planned way that led to the division between Angola and Regional, but in the understanding, just because of all the people who were involved in capoeira when it became a global export. It became a global export because it was defined as something as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Before we begin our story here about the division and the growth of the spread between Angola and Regional, we need to understand that even today, by international standards, there's a lot of outspoken criticism of Brazilian culture and the racism against anything that's Afro-Brazilian or anything that's black. So to understand that, we need to understand that Brazil has a long tradition also of racial discrimination. And people will say, Brazil is this and that, but it's easy to assume something when you want to. But I'm going to be talking more about the academic, and nobody in academic circles thinks that Brazil is one giant melting pot of racial harmony. Everybody knows in the academic circles, on the different panels, on the different conventions and encounters I've gone to, everyone talks about that, especially anyone from Afro-Brazilian background in Brazil. I've never heard anyone say that Brazil is a melting pot once they're being very sincere. So we understand that, and you can only imagine that the more back in time, the more racial discrimination existed. So let me jump right into how the division of Capoeira Angola and Capoeira Regional started. First, we have to understand the government's involvement in the creation and legalization of capoeira. Getúlio Vargas was actually a fascist, but he also understood the importance of creating a national Brazilian identity. And it was in the 30s and in the 20s that he decided that we need to have things that are Brazilian, right? For example, the United States, minorities and the general population tends to get together when we have a national hero, for example, especially in sports. The power of sports and the cultural currency of sports is incredible because it's easy to understand and can reach everybody, all levels of education and understanding. So in the 1920s and 1930s, Getúlio Vargas and his administration decided they wanted to find things to represent Brazilian culture. And as part of that movement and the popularity of Mestre Vibes, it was seen as something to promote a Brazilian martial art, a Brazilian identity. And this is why Regional especially became more and more supported by the government, and finally in the 30s being taken off of the penal code and no longer considered an illegal art or an illegal practice or something that you could get in trouble for. So when Mestre Vibes became more and more famous and the identity became more and more culturally valuable and more cultural currency, people who were focused at the time on creating a Brazilian national identity, of course, used all the cultural currency to push capoeira to become a Brazilian identity, a Brazilian art. And this led to something that was going to be taking place for the next 30 years or so. However, during the 40s and 50s, there's also a very big switch in Bahia. The Afro-Brazilian community, with the discovery of oil, there was a lot of instantly created a new middle class in Bahia. And this middle class had more access to better jobs and more cultural expression. And this is where we see the beginning of the Blocos Afros, Ileaie, and so forth. And these were going to be the seeds and the foundation for what was going to happen later and affect not only the Afro-Brazilian identity, but also the exportation of capoeira. So now we're looking at the 1960s. If we think about what was going on in the world in the 1960s, we see that there was a lot of repression in Brazil against anything Afro-Brazilian or unions or mass rule. But not only that, something really, really interesting happened that was revolutionary, that had never actually happened in modern history. In the United States, we had what we call the civil rights movement. After the civil rights movement, we had our first generation of educated African Americans, people of African descent in the United States, who were able to go on to college in masses. I'm not going to say that, it was a lot or a little, because that's relevant to today. I'm not comparing it today. But at the time, it opened a lot of doors to African American and African diaspora meaning the spread of African people around the world, especially through the transatlantic slave trade. And many of these newly educated and newly financially independent African Americans decided from the United States to go out into Latin America and discover and connect with their African roots. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the difference between the growth of slavery and the results of slavery in the United States and Latin America, because Latin America is so big. So I'm going to focus here only on comparing general African American experience with general Afro-Brazilian experience. So in Brazil, neither of the slave systems by any means were humane, kind, different. The institution of slavery is one of the most horrific things that humans have ever discovered. Now, the problem with the Latin American and the transatlantic slave trade, it was the first time that slavery had become based on race, but also on economics. It was you were a tool, people were dehumanized. So I'll get into that in another podcast. I want to keep the podcast on point to Angola Regional. So many of these young African Americans who had now received college education and academic wealth were able to go to Latin America and rediscover or discover or try to connect with their African American or Afro-Latino community. This movement was called the Soul Movement, right, of the 1960s in academia. So the Soul Movement consisted of African Americans and Canadian African Americans or Canadian Afro-Canadians going into other parts of Latin America and really trying to connect with aspects of African culture, because the main difference is not that it did or didn't, but the level of where Afro-Latinos, especially in Brazil, were allowed to keep their cultural traditions, even though they were mixed in the different slave cycles. So now what we're going to understand is that we have a very powerful small group of non-Afro-Latinos, or let's say North American, African American descent, trying to politically influence the identity of Afro-Brazilians. And when you're coming from a foreign country, especially the United States, to Brazil at the time, because even now there's still that glamorization of America or outside of the United States, that they knew better, that they were more educated. Also, you have to think about the socioeconomic state of people who were involved in capoeira at the time. They basically were the lowest income or social classes of the northeast of Brazil, or Bahia or Rio or whatever. So all of a sudden you have these educated, in the know and financially supportive people who are saying, no, what you're doing, it's not Brazilian, it is African. And this is when we start to get all these conversations about that capoeira was from Africa. Because prior to that, if you look at any other research, there might be signals that there were vestiges of it, or there were different attributes from Africa, but no one really said, oh, it's African. That was only after the 1960s. And why? Because if you're someone who is trying to get to sell your cultural currency, even though you've done your life of capoeira, you're trying to sell your cultural currency, you're going to sell it to whoever will listen, whoever will give you some form of financial or psychological return for what you do. So imagine the situation. African American or educated young Americans, and again, I say that in quotation marks, come to Bahia, to Rio de Janeiro, and they're saying, hey, look, we're looking for authentic capoeira. Once that word authentic was added, this is where everything became the division of Capoeira Angola and Regional. Now you have the camp that was raised and politicized to be Brazilian as a result of the move that Getúlio Vargas and the things that he had done. And now you have people who are like, oh, no, we're African, we're Afro-Brazilian, we're Afro-Latino. And I say that because realistically, not most people think about that. They just accept life. But now you have people influencing that. And once you get into this authenticity, then you're going to push as much as you can to be the most authentic person. This is where you all of a sudden start getting Capoeira Angola and Capoeira Regional separating, because both trying to show more authenticity of what's the real capoeira. And today we realize that there's no such thing as real capoeira. For me as a mestre, especially as a non-Brazilian mestre, I feel I can go anywhere in the world and play capoeira because I understand the cultural background and the cultural understanding of capoeira, whether it's Afro-Brazilian, African, or Brazilian. So most importantly to understand about this conversation is that there were a lot of political factors that influenced the division of Capoeira Angola and Capoeira Regional. Eventually today, now it's popular. If you notice, people who tend to do Angola tend to dress in a more Rasta way, or in a more, I don't want to say African way, because Africa also has a large diverse base. But when we think about Capoeira Angola today, we see people dressing in the stereotypical, let's say, Rastafarian fashion. While when we see people doing Capoeira Regional, they tend to be more in a sporty, cleaner cut Brazilian fashion. And that's also up for debate, because there's also the cultural currency of selling your ethnicity, right? Again, the authenticity. If I'm Afro-Brazilian, if I'm African-American, and I wear dreads and I look more capoeira looking, then I have more cultural currency. So walking away today, I hope you guys understand a little bit more about how the political factors and the social factors and the division of Capoeira Angola grew from the soul movement and the influence of the other parts of Brazilian culture and international movements in education. Guys, like I said, I'm going to put this up on my YouTube, and I'll try to put up everything this week just as a sample for people. And then from next week, we'll be back on Patreon. Guys, thank you so much for listening. And if you guys have any questions, again, email me, because I'm more than happy to answer the questions as best I can. And if I'm wrong, hey, I'm more than happy to change my ideas too. Guys, Mestre Sukuri coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. Have a blessed day.